Look around you at this village and you will see the trace of men long gone. Listen to its story and you will hear the heartbeat of old England. Close your eyes and you will feel the touch of 40 generations past, and then
you may start to wonder whom those people were who made Smarden. You may start to wonder whom those people were who made Smarden.
This is a story about the men and women of Smarden, whose hands and hearts have shaped our village history, and whose legacy of the farms, fields and chapels of this quiet corner of Kent has now been passed to us. Smarden has been home to both wealth and grinding poverty. It has been graced by royalty, but many more times visited by pestilence. It has given birth to new ideas and beliefs, endured persecution and survived intolerance. And as this story unfolds, we begin to understand this. These Smarden folk were men and women of unusually strong character and opinions. Time and again we find Smarden on the national stage, voicing opinion in no uncertain terms on subjects such as taxation, democracy and human rights. True-to-life manifestations of the old Kentish saying, "They can poke and they can shove, but I'm danged if I'll be druv." The story echoes across centuries, and only recently have hunger and sickness ceased to be a fact of village life. But through all the ups and downs in our village fortunes, one precious thread remains unbroken today: the village and its people who work the land. Because of them, Adam of Essex, who became the first rector of Smarden 800 years ago, would still recognise the fields and lanes of Smarden. And he would probably nod with approval at the close sense of community still vibrant in the parish 8 centuries later. So here is our story, and in it you may find answers to such questions as: why does the road bend like that in the centre of the village? Why does Smarden have so many places of worship? How did the Minnis get its name? Smarden is often described in the guidebooks as Kent's loveliest village. Listen to this writer a few years ago.
Times without number I heard Smarden called the perfect village. Once you have been to Smarden, you cannot but agree. In more tourist-conscious districts, Smarden would be host to coachloads of visitors. There would be Smarden souvenirs, antique shops, and ye olde tea rooms. But Smarden does not seek to project to its image. It's content to be itself, a working place among the orchards and the fields. Yet, strolling about the village, you sense that here is something subtly different, and this sense does not deceive you. You feel something of the dignity and the commercial influence of a medieval town as you walk among its venerable buildings.
But listen to this 2 centuries ago.
The parish of Smarden is about 4 miles across each way. It is a flat, low situation, very unpleasant and watery, the soil being a deep clay. The eastern parts are mostly covered with coppice wood, and the whole of it, from the flatness of it, the wide hedgerows and the quantity of oak trees spread over it, has a very gloomy appearance. The town or village is on the turnpike road from Faversham through Charing hither, and so on to Biddenden, Cranbrook and Tenterden, a road which, from the depth of the soil and the want of having any improvement ever made on it, is, in the winter, or indeed after any wet weather, hardly passable throughout this parish, even for waggons.
This was the great Kent historian Hasted. The man was clearly not impressed, and touches on one feature which has contributed more than any other to Smarden's character: bad roads. And they were not just bad, they didn't actually really go anywhere. And if you think about it, they still don't. the lines of modern communication run from the Channel to London, whereas Smarden's drove roads just lead on deeper into the Weald. Let's go back to the beginning, to the settlers who followed these roads into the Wealden Forest over 1500 years ago.
A Roman coin found at Romden, nearby Roman roads, and distinctive field patterns around the village certainly point to Roman occupation, but the theory waits to be proven. Our tale must start with the Saxons. They came along drove roads from the downland beyond Charing to fatten their pigs in forest pastures. If you come to Smarden today from Egerton and Charing, you are travelling on a 1,000-year-old road system. We know a few of these early Saxon settlers by name, so let's meet our first Smarden villagers. This is Ummer. He farmed at a place called Ummer's Woodland Pasture, Ummingden. By 1270 it became Hominden. Today we know Ummer's farm as Ommenden. Ummer had a few farming friends whose names we still speak every day. Killy, whose land was called Killy's Watermeadow, or Kellisham. By 1244 it will be Kellisham, and today Kelsham. Next there was Hunmere. His farm bordered the Sherway stream and is called now Homershem. Then there was Herefrith, recorded here in 863, which became our Haffenden. Lucan farmed a wooded rise called Lucanhurst, which we know today as Luckhurst. One field close to the village centre is the Minnis, from the Saxon Gemenissi, meaning common or communal woodland. At some point the Minnis came into the possession of the Drainers, of whom we will hear much more later, and in Victorian times a dispute arose when the then owner, Mr. Hines, padlocked the stile which gave access to the field. The Minnis was purchased between the wars for the village by 2 generous parishioners and subsequently by the parish. The name Smarden derives from Saxon words meaning the fat or greasy pasture or clearing, which could mean a particularly fertile place for fattening pigs and making butter, or perhaps Greece is the same as the reference made by our famous writer from 200 years ago. It is a flat, low situation, very unpleasant and watery, the soil being a deep clay. Of course, this comment about clay oversimplifies Smarden's geology. Along the banks of the belt and elsewhere are areas of lighter soil, easier to work and better cropping. Are those fields the original fat pastures which gave Smarden its name?
When Christianity first came to Smarden, the search for a site for a cross and later a church would have centred on finding ground safe from flooding. The place where the church stands now and eastwards towards the street is such an area. There's other high ground in the parish, such as at Tilden, but the tracks from Headcorn and Bindon crossing at the ford gave good access to the present spot. The bend in the belt here was also significant. In early Christian thought this would symbolize the serpent whereby the curving river represents evil to enter on one side and depart on the other. Smarden Church was dedicated to the Archangel St. Michael. Why St. Michael? The choice is interesting because he is associated with sites on high ground such as St. Michael's Mount or Mont Saint-Michel. Would it be too fanciful to speculate that in an otherwise low-lying place such as Smarden, this was an appropriate dedication? One of the earliest references to Smarden is in 1205, when Adam de Essex,
became the first recorded rector. His church was built of wood and had a bell tower. No trace survives of the old church. It certainly had a bell tower in the 14th century because in 1361 John Hampden left in his will a gift of land for the replacement of the church bell ropes, probably land around the site of the house bell ropes today. On June the 19th, 1299, Edward I travelled through Smarden on his way across the Weald. His was the first of 2 royal progressions through Smarden, the second being Queen Elizabeth's over 250 years later. In the days when kings and queens held the reins of power, these visits were undoubtedly major opportunities for the village to get noticed, but for most villages they were probably occasions to be dreaded, as we shall see later. Just over 20 years after the visit of Edward I, Edward III, known as the father of English commerce from his policies in support of cloth-making, granted the Archbishop of Canterbury the right for Smarden to hold a weekly market and a fair on the 29th of September, that's around Michaelmas, for 5 days each year. The market existed for about 450 years, firstly in the broad earth-floored nave of the church, and later outside, and finally in the town barn in the street, which burned down in 1948. English heritage suggests that the marketplace was a broad area at the end of the street, with the Bindon to Pluckley Road perhaps running along a line south of the present street, at the rear of the present row of houses. And according to Mills, the road from the Bell turned left at Gillett's Oast and wound round the back of the Chequers to enter the village beside School House. Smarden was now a market town, right up there with the likes of Tunbridge, Maidstone and Ashford, and this status was cause for celebration. The dynamic combination of cloth and agriculture would later give rise to the Kentish yeomen whose graceful timber-framed houses impress us as much today as they surely did then. As late as the last century, the phrase "going to town" was used, meaning a trip into the village. For the moment, the future was bright. The king was actively encouraging the weaving industry by granting franchises to skilled immigrants from the Netherlands, and with its market town status, Smarden was set to grow. This spirit of optimism was marked by the decision to build a new church. The church is built of Kentish ragstone and Bethersden marble, and is famously known as the Barn of Kent because of its 36-foot wide nave and unsupported scissor beam roof. The beams were once concealed, but were happily exposed again when the church was restored a century ago. One of the most mysterious items in Smarden Church is mounted on the poor men's box, which sits on a pedestal of solid oak and fastened by 3 locks, 1 key for the priest and 1 each for the church wardens. On the lid is a curious enamel upon copper, once part of original series fixed on a shrine. The image represents a baptism. The rich blue colour and workmanship suggests that this was made at Limoges, and similar enamels can be seen in the Museum of Cluny in Paris. How did this enamel find its way to Smarden? Might it have been the gift of a soldier returning from the wars in France? Nobody knows the truth, but an intriguing link does exist between Smarden and Limoges. Smarden's charter was granted by King Edward III. The charter was granted to the Archbishop of Canterbury. King Edward's son, the Black Prince, was closely connected to Canterbury. He chose to be buried there rather than at Westminster. The Black Prince ruled the French province of Aquitaine, and thus Limoges, for 10 years. In 1370, the Black Prince plundered Limoges, and soon after returned to England. So, did King Edward call upon the Archbishop of Canterbury to supply men for his son's army? And if so, where did the Archbishop look? Would he have recruited from a vibrant young market town? And did the enamel come to Smarden in the baggage of a village soldier? This strange carving in the church has also puzzled historians. This is the north wall of the nave near the eastern end, about 8 feet from the ground, carved in Bethersden marble. He is pulling his mouth open and has bracelets on the arms. Who is he? Is he pagan? Many experts believe so, or he may be linked to Whitsun ales. There's another figure at Chalk Church reckoned to be connected with these ales. Another window, known as the low side window, was placed to face the village and reminds us of our sometimes grim past. This window would have allowed villagers who had been excluded from the church due to disease to participate in the ceremony. The drain in the east wall is where the priest could wash his hands after ministering to leprous or infected parishioners. Nobody anticipated that 60 years after the charter was granted, a future Archbishop of Canterbury was to be dragged from his altar, executed, and his body flung in a field, or that Smarden men could be caught up in that violence.
Of all sorts of callings that in England be, there is none that liveth so gallant as we. Our trading maintains us as brave as a knight. We live at our pleasure and taketh delight. We heap up riches and treasure great store, which we get by griping and grinding the poor. And this is a way for to fill up our purse, although we do get it with many a curse.
We heapeth up riches and treasure great store, which we do get by gripping and grinding the poor. These lines from a popular 16th century song entitled The Clothier gives us an insight into the less than happy relationship between the cloth makers and their workers. It was of course cloth which brought the wealth and left its mark in the shape of our timber-framed hall houses, and despite the suggestion of worker exploitation, our village poor undoubtedly did benefit from the extra income from weaving and spinning, despite being paid up to 6 months in arrears. Smarden has usually been portrayed as a broadcloth weaving village. This is only half true. Broadcloth weaving was centred upon Cranbrook, where some of Kent's largest producers established themselves. Biddenden was also a significant broadcloth village. Then to the east was the Kersey district. This was a cheaper cloth, and was made in Smarden and Pluckley, although Smarden did also produce broadcloth. Whereas broadcloth was produced largely for export along big business lines, the Kersey makers were small, supplying local markets. They catered for ordinary people and would have clothed many backs throughout Kent. The building of Smarden clothiers' houses began in the mid-14th century, and many of them, in the words of Mills, wear their years so kindly. Let's see them not as they look today, but as they appeared over 100 years ago. By then they had become home to farmers and shopkeepers. Here is the Dragon House, divided into 2 houses, a tin shop on the left and a sweet shop on the right. Here 2 top-hatted Victorians pose in front of Chessenden, once called townhouse and used to house the village poor. Here is the thatched house, seemingly divided into two. Village tradition has it that the road once passed at the back of the house. And the Cloth Hall, with its sale price early last century. The earlier name was Turk Farm, after the farming family of that name, and was where the church's patch window glass was installed in the mid-1500s. A hoist and access doors to the two floors for wool bales are still to be seen. These are the monuments to our clothiers, first built open from floor to roof without a nail to pin a joint, and testifying to the builder's art in the Middle Ages. The cloth industry was boosted by Edward III's policy of encouraging foreign weavers to settle in England, so that, coupled with their income from farming, the newly emerged yeomen of Smarden were living in the richest county in England at that time. The Pells were said to be Smarden's first Flemish family, arriving here in 1331. As we shall discover, this family was destined to enjoy prosperity, suffer persecution, and be struck down by murderous tragedy until it disappears from our records in the 1600s.
1611. Mark Davy of Pluckley stands accused of homicide. On the 6th of December 1610, Davy attacked his victim, threw him to the ground, spurned and bruised him. The man died 2 days later. His name was Thomas Pell and his profession surgeon.
King Edward III sent a secret emissary to Flanders to recruit weavers. Here's how he describes the delights that awaited them if they should decide to leave their homes for a new life in England.
How happy they should be if they would but come over into England, bringing their mystery with them, which would provide their welcome in all places. Here they should feed on fat beef and mutton, till nothing but their fullness should stint their stomachs. Yea, they should feed on the labours of their own hands.
The Flemish weavers were more a symptom than a cause of the expansion of weaving, their contribution being mainly new varieties of cloth and various technical improvements. But in Smarden their influence remains with us today. We see Dutch influence in the Dragon House end onto the street. We see it in the Flemish furniture such as this chest found in a Smarden barn. And we hear it in the way people of Smarden say Hamden, Tilden or Romden. The village localities, which we call quarters, are thought to derive from these settlers. And do we also hear echoes from these early weaving days in the surname of one of Smarden's most celebrated families? This tool was used in the fulling process to cleanse the cloth. It is called a bat.
First to the combers we'll bring them down, from 8 groats a score unto half a crown. If at all they murmur and say 'tis too small, we'll bid them choose whether they will work at all. We'll make them believe that trading is bad. We care not a pin, though they're ne'er so sad. And this is a way for to fill our purse, although we do get it with many a curse.
But is this how the clothiers regarded them? So long as the comber can work with his comb, the tucker and spinner that spins all the year will make them earn their wages full dear. Women would spin in nearly every cottage in the parish, by candlelight into the night after farm work by day.
Thus do we gain all our wealth and estate, by many poor men that works early and late. If it were not for those that do labour full hard, we might go and hang ourselves without regard. The combers and weavers and tuckers also, with the spinners that worketh for wages full low. By these people's labours we fill up our purse, although we do get it with many a curse.
And first to the coombers we will bring them down from 8 groats a score and to half a crown. If at all they murmur and say it's too small, we bid them choose whether they will work at all. But even as the new church was being built, other problems began to emerge. The wealth earned from cloth was not spread equally around the village. Labouring families lived in squalor. Then the Black Death appeared in England in 1348. But there are no records that tell us what happened in Smarden when the Black Death broke out. Some historians think that the population of England was halved by the year 1400, and 1,000 villages totally disappeared. These problems reached crisis point when 3 wet summers ruined crops and brought the country close to starvation. With fewer people to farm the land, it seems likely that many Smarden fields reverted to scrub and woodland. The toil of generations would have been undone in a matter of years. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the first attempt by ordinary working men in England to improve their lot. Under Wat Tyler of Maidstone, an army of peasants, including Smarden villagers, stormed the jails at Maidstone and Canterbury, set free the prisoners, including John Ball, and burned the tax records.
John Gurnays, John Hayman, Robert Stonford, all of Smarden, feloniously made insurrection against our Lord the King, and they are still assembled and continue their evil designs.
Then, joined by more rebels from Essex, they descended on London, where the mob got out of hand. Murder and looting followed. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Chancellor were brutally killed. Eventually the mob was confronted outside London by the 14-year-old King Richard, and Wat Tyler was killed. The uprising fizzled out. But even as our charter was being ratified, the cloth industry, which had generated so much prosperity in the Weald, received a mortal blow. In 1566, an Act of Parliament was passed designed to assist the struggling cloth industry, but which had precisely the opposite effect. The Act prohibited the export of unfinished cloth, but in the process important trading links were broken.
We've worn up our bags of silver and gold, but conscience and charity with us is bold. By poor people's labour we fill up our purse, although we do get it with many a curse. By poor people's labour we fill up our purse, although we do get it with many a curse.
In the summer of 1450, nearly 100 men from Smarden marched to London and fought alongside thousands of other rebels from Kent in what is called the Jack Cade Rising. The men from Smarden were what we would now call middle class, and consisted of the majority of the able-bodied men of the village at that time. The causes of this rebellion were various. Corruption and oppression by tax collectors — nothing has changed in 500 years. More or less a mini-dictatorship existed in Maidstone involving extortion and forced imprisonment. It was also rumoured that the king was about to take retribution for the murder of his favourite, the Earl of Suffolk, at Dover, by turning much of Kent into a wasteland. Nevertheless, it's curious that most of Smarden's able-bodied men were prepared to leave their trades and farms at midsummer to join such a hazardous adventure. The rebellion ended in plunder, looting and murder, and finally with a bloody battle on London Bridge on the night of July the 5th. The ringleader, Jack Cade, with a bounty on his head, was hunted down and killed, some say at Hothfield. In the aftermath, 26 leaders of the rebellion were executed and quartered. Cade's head was displayed on a pole on London Bridge. The other rebels, including the Smarden men, were all pardoned. So, Cade was dead, the rebellion put down, and Smarden's men had returned to the village in time for harvest, or so the story goes. But how much of this is true? Can we really believe that so many young men of our village were prepared to march with a known villain like Cade, and put not only their own lives at risk, but those of their families? Had things turned out badly, the survival of the entire village would surely have been in the balance. Could there be another explanation? Recent research hints at a different reason why our Smarden men appear in the Cade story. It seems that on the 6th and 7th of July 1450 at Southwark, pardons were granted to some 3,300 people, promising immunity from all future actions of royal officials of any kind. A pardon such as this was an escape route available to anyone and free of payment, and was quite naturally taken advantage of by men other than the rebels themselves, particularly as it was still unclear who were to be the real losers, the rebels or the corrupt royal officials. Thus we see pardons being granted to the likes of Robert Est of Maidstone, who was one of the most corrupt and powerful tax collectors. The list of guilty men who were pardoned is a long one, and that's not all. Pardons were sought and given to numerous local officials, and many hundreds of village and town inhabitants, such as the wealthy gentleman of Canterbury, who had vigorously resisted Cade's mob. Was this then what happened at Smarden? Did nobody except perhaps a handful actually march? Did our quick-thinking villagers add their names to the list? People essential to the ongoing welfare of the village, the weavers and tailors? Or did the village actually turn out and fight for what they believed was right? Remember, you can poke and you can shove, but I'm danged if I'll be druv.
But evil times lay in wait, as religious intolerance brought a new kind of terror to England. The shocking events which took place in Smarden over the next century and a half can only be understood if we recognise the passions aroused by religious belief in England at that period. The village became torn between Anglican and Catholic worship, and we even witnessed the insanity of a parishioner put on trial for her life, accused of witchcraft. On the 31st of January 1556, a Smarden widow by the name of Agnes Snowth was burned at the stake in Canterbury, together with 5 other martyrs. In the powerful words of a historian of that time,
"They went out into the highways and hedges. They gathered up the lame, the halt, the blind. They took the weaver from his loom, the carpenter from his workshop, and the husbandman from his plough. And of these they made their burnt offerings."
It was pretty well impossible to live in Smarden at that time and not be affected by religion, for better or worse. The church dictated how people were to lead their lives. So we find villagers falling foul of church law, such as
1581, September the 21st, we present Robert Adam of Smarden on being found with one Francis Noble and Fridwith Taylor, the wife of Richard Taylor, in his barn after dark.
1586, Edward Gorham for denying to pay 12 pence for his absence from church. 1597, Thomas Tong for selling bread and beer in the time of divine service.
The Tongs are an interesting family, Thomas being a man of considerable enterprise, which seemed to get him into trouble with the authorities, as we shall see.
1609, William Herndon for brawling in the church and swearing by God's foot in a great rage and anger.
Sometimes complaints came from the other direction.
1608, 6th of April. Also at Christmas last, the wine which was provided was offensive to divers of the communicants, being dreggy and having some rags in it.
But the village had a reputation for thinking for itself. In Smarden, men and women had their own ideas about society and religion, and the seeds had long been sown for the Baptist movement, which first burst forth in the 1600s. To avoid fines or imprisonment, the early Baptists met in the homes of other members. The law forbade more than 5 persons to meet for worship. The penalty was a £20 fine on the preacher and householder, plus 5 shillings on each person attending. Half of the total fine was then awarded to the person who informed. By 1676, Smarden had 100 nonconformists, maybe 1 in 5 of the population.
At the top of the village tree we find our gentry, in this case John Drainer, a justice of the peace who lived at Romden. Drainer died in 1567 and came from one of Cranbrook's most illustrious cloth families. His net worth was £900, including £300 in cloth goods. He owned 520 acres in Smarden, perhaps a quarter of the farmed land, of which he worked 63 acres himself and let the rest to 14 different village farmers. One way or another, most people in the village would have had some reliance of his goodwill. Unfortunately, Drainer had little of that to offer. John Drainer was rich, powerful and dissolute. He was a drinker and a womanizer. He was also, ironically, a religious fanatic. When he was bravely criticised from the pulpit by Gregory Dodds the rector, he was determined to punish Dodds for his words. He is the man of the famous Justice Nineholes legend. This happened around the time that Agnes Snowth met her death, a time when villagers paid with their lives for religious dissent. John Drainer is said to have drilled 9 holes in the rood screen to see who was not following the service in the reintroduced Catholic manner. It was fear of Drainer which ultimately led Dodds to flee the village. At this time there were 3 great books which were read and used in nearly every parish church in the land, and in the growing number of houses and cottages where people had learned to read. First there was the Bible, then the prayer book, and thirdly a book known as John Foxe's Book of Martyrs. Our 2 friends Agnes Snowth and John Drainer both appear in Foxe's book, but Drainer sought out Foxe in an attempt to have criticism of his character written out of the book. Foxe refused and retaliated that he had witnesses who had heard a drunken Drainer joke that he'd actually drilled the holes to get a better view of the village wenches. Shamed, Drainer went away and his unhappy story appeared in the book for all England to read.
Our village was honoured with a royal visit in 1573. A progress will have 400 wagons, some with 6 horses and as many as 2,400 pack horses. That's many hundreds of people, and you can reckon on as many sightseers as well. They travel 12 miles a day if the going's good. They bring her state bed, her hip bath, clothes, jewellery and linen. When the Queen entered Smarden, the tail of her convoy was just leaving Cranbrook. All day and into the night they came through. As it passed, we watched the procession. Imposing it was, and I made out some very distinguished persons. My preparations for her visit covered every detail necessary to avoid any inconvenience to Her Majesty. We had toiled hard for weeks. Dunghills were removed, the roads ploughed up and mended, then spread with gravel. The people checked for signs of the plague. We locked up the beggars and ordered no farmers to drive cattle through the village. The alehouse keepers were told to have horses ready and good ale to serve. Her Majesty's royal purveyors, those men are robbers. They have authority for about 30 miles either side of the line of route. They must find corn, hay, oats, ale, meat, and carts for which they pay a miserly 10 shillings a cart. Wealthy farmers bribe the purveyors to stay clear. The rest just hide everything away. The church bells were rung. Had we not done this, and 2 other places did forget, the royal almoner would levy a 5-shilling fine and seal the church doors until we pay. All the houses were decked with flowers and greenery, but as the wagon train continued to pass the village, my problems began. There were complaints of damage to houses, barns, fences and hedges. We knew about the pilfering and moved cattle out and locked up all the pigs and hens, but they came looking. Oh yes, dozens of these villains swarming all around looking for anything they could take. We were stripped bare of firewood and the fields of rabbits. Our poorest will have empty bellies this winter. But the Queen herself was pleased enough with Smarden, and we have our new charter. And tell the truth, we are still proud enough today to tell of the day when good Queen Bess's gaze first fell upon this old tower.
Matthew Hartnett was a founding father of the Baptist movement. He was also one of our early village doctors. The emblem of the Apothecaries' Company can be seen carved on the house. Across the road stands the row of cottages in Water Lane, which have always been known as doctors' cottages. Matthew Hartnett is truly one of our village heroes and was an important and influential figure in the parish. He is mentioned twice in the church book as having given money to poor villagers. In 1666 the plague raged in Kent. That year Smarden escaped, but Matthew was confronted with this incurable horror in 1671 when the plague finally reached us. More than 50 villagers died that year and were buried in specially dug pits as far away as the Smarden woods. Before Hartnett's time, an assortment of villagers had practised medicine illegally. Even our friend Thomas Tong, who, as we have seen, sold beer when he shouldn't have, tried his hand at the healer's art.
1605. Thomas Tong for practising surgery without a licence.
Villagers were naturally keen not to take on the burden of supporting people from outside the parish. Beggars and vagrants would be ordered out of the village.
William Taylor, a sturdy vagrant beggar, tall of stature, long brown hair, and lame of one leg, aged about 30 years of upwards, was at this 11th day of December, in the 29th year of the reign of our sovereign lord King Charles II, openly whipped according to the law for a wandering rogue, and is assigned forthwith to pass from parish to parish by the officers thereof, the next straight way to Smarden, where he confesseth he was born, and he is limited to be at Smarden within 4 days.
Those living on parish relief were expected to earn their keep, and the village would try to provide the means for them to do so.
1744, May the 25th, it was agreed that Mary Bat shall have the spinning work of the parish flax, instead of other relief. 1712, lent Abraham Corns, by ye parishioners' consent, £3 to buy him a cow. 1662, paid for letting Ann Turner's blood and mending her shoes. 1700, for Daniel Rayner's coffin, for laying him forth, and for £1 of wool to sock him in. 1745, for John Dixon's keep and beer while he was at the Chequer.
Matthew Hartnett lived through the Civil War. The war ended in 1646 and the parliamentarians quickly sought revenge. Committees were set up by Oliver Cromwell's government to dispense their own justice to those who had supported the king. This is how one historian describes the way these committees operated.
This man's estate is confiscated because he spoke sneeringly of the new government. That man's because he did not welcome Cromwell's troopers as dear friends, and was overheard to say that he wished them elsewhere. The third man is half ruined because he sang a cavalier ditty over a drink.
We do not know if the Pells fought against Cromwell, or whether they fell victim to someone with a grudge, but we know that Robert Pell was accused by the government of collaborating with Royalists, and brought in front of the committee. He may have felt himself lucky to have escaped with a fine of £10. These were indeed troubled times, but some good men left their mark. The Dadson Trust was founded in 1716 by Stephen Dadson, an illiterate bricklayer from Betherston. He left 2 farms and a house for a school. This house eventually became dilapidated, and in October 1864 the school moved to its new home, seen here a year after it opened. The building cost was £915 and 12 shillings. This farm in Pluckley was left in 1686 by Jacob Turner to provide for our poor. The Turner and Addson charities continue their good work today, echoes from a time when the village took responsibility for its poor. Later benefactors were the Hines family, who once owned the 200-acre Gillett's estate. The Hines are one of several prominent Smarden families who started life with nothing, and who by hard toil and no little skill became in the course of 1 or 2 generations considerable farmers. Hines is best remembered today for his gifts of land on which stand the school and the village pump, once one of 6 pumps in the village, and for the organ to his memory in the church he helped restore.